My sister called my architecture firm a fake job for the last time on a Thursday evening in October at my parents' dining room table in front of 7 people who laughed. My name is Celeste Harmon, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I did not flinch. I did not excuse myself to cry in the bathroom. I did not perform the particular kind of wounded dignity that women in my position are expected to perform. I simply lifted my wine glass, a 2014 Chateau Margaux that my parents had uncorked specifically for my sister Bria's engagement announcement, and I took a slow, deliberate sip and I catalogued the table. My mother, Shirley, was smiling, not at me, through me. My father, Douglas, was already reaching for the bread basket, the conversation over in his estimation before it had properly registered. My sister Bria, 29 years old and newly engaged to a man named Todd who sold commercial insurance and used the word synergy without irony, was giggling at her own joke, her left hand extended slightly so the table could admire the ring. A round cut diamond, I noticed, set in a thin pavé band. Purchased, I would later confirm, with a line of credit Todd had not disclosed to her. My husband, Marcus, was seated beside me. He placed 2 fingers on the back of my hand, the lightest possible pressure, the kind of touch that says, I see exactly what is happening here, and so do you. That was the entire communication we needed. I did not scream. I did not produce a single tear. I folded the moment with the clinical precision of someone who has been folding moments like it for years, pressing each one flat, storing it in the correct drawer. And I looked at my sister, who was still laughing, and I noticed the particular quality of her laugh, the way it pitched slightly too high when she needed the room to confirm that she was right about something. She needed confirmation constantly. I had simply never named that need before. I named it that Thursday. Fake job, she had said. I mean, come on, you've been playing architect for what, 15 years? Do you even have clients like real ones? 7 people laughed. I sipped the Chateau Margaux. Marcus placed 2 fingers on my hand, and somewhere beneath the surface of my composed expression, a decision completed itself. Not a new decision. The final confirmation of one that had been forming for a very long time. I had sold my firm 3 days prior for $14 million. Wired, confirmed, transferred, and sitting in an account that no one at that table knew existed. The acquisition had closed quietly, with a non-disclosure clause that gave me 60 days of discretion. I had 60 days to tell the truth or to tell something else entirely. My husband had looked at me the morning after the wire cleared and said, Tell your parents and sister we're bankrupt. Let's see who stays. I had looked back at him and said nothing for a long moment. Then I said, Give me until Thursday. Thursday came. My sister called my 15 years of work a fake job in front of 7 people. My mother smiled through me. My father reached for the bread. I finished the Chateau Margaux. I drove home in silence, and I told Marcus, We'll tell them at Sunday dinner. He nodded once. No celebration, no hesitation. Just a shared understanding between 2 people who had been quietly watching the same thing for a very long time, and had finally agreed that it was time to stop watching and start documenting. If you have ever sat across a dining room table from people who share your blood and felt absolutely, precisely invisible, then you already understand the particular quality of that Sunday dinner. You understand what it means to finally stop performing the role they assigned you and to simply begin watching them perform theirs. If this story is already touching something you recognize from your own life, I want you to stay with me. Leave a comment below if you have ever been dismissed by the people who were supposed to be in your corner, if you have ever carried something alone that your family should have helped you carry, and instead they made you feel ashamed of the weight. Subscribe because what comes next in this story is not a single confrontation. It is a sequence. A very carefully designed sequence that I spent 11 days constructing with the same discipline I brought to every project I ever built. I never designed a single structure without understanding the load-bearing points first. Families are no different. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare started. The first thing you need to understand about my family is that they were not cruel people in the way that word usually implies. They did not shout. They did not strike. They were instead practitioners of a far more sophisticated damage, the kind that arrives in small, consistent doses over many years, each one individually dismissible, collectively lethal. My parents, Douglas and Shirley Peterman, before I became Celeste Harmon through marriage at 31 years old, had built what they considered a respectable life in Naperville, Illinois. My father worked 31 years as a regional manager for a commercial printing company. My mother taught elementary school art for 22 years before retiring at 58 with a pension she referenced in nearly every conversation about financial security. They owned a 4-bedroom colonial on Whitmore Terrace, drove American cars they replaced every 5 years, and attended the same church they had attended since before I was born. They were organized people, careful people, people who understood that the world had rules, and that following those rules produced a specific, predictable kind of safety. What they did not understand, and what I spent the better part of my adult life trying to accept that they would never understand, was that I was not interested in that particular kind of safety. I was 12 years old when I first sketched a floor plan, not for a school project, for myself. I had become quietly obsessed with the way that a room could make a person feel, the way that ceiling height changed breathing, the way that natural light moved through a space at different hours and altered the emotional temperature of everything inside it. My mother had walked into my bedroom one afternoon, looked at the papers spread across my floor, and said, with genuine bewilderment, "What is all this mess?" I had tried to explain. She had listened with the patient expression of someone who has already decided that what they are hearing does not require full attention. That was the template. It repeated itself with minor variations for the next 32 years. When I enrolled in the architecture program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, my father had asked, with no detectable irony, whether there was a business track I could add so I would have something to fall back on. When I graduated with honors and secured my first position at a mid-size firm in Chicago, my mother had called to ask whether the benefits package included dental, before she asked anything else. When I announced, 7 years later, that I was leaving that position to start my own practice, Harmon Design Group, from the second bedroom of the apartment Marcus, and I shared in Logan Square, my sister Bria, 22 years old at the time and completing a degree in communications, had laughed out loud at the dinner table and said, "Oh, so now you're a businesswoman?" She said it the way you say something that is obviously a joke. She expected the table to confirm that it was a joke. The table confirmed it. Marcus had been the single exception in that room, and even Marcus's defense of me had been measured, careful. He said, "Celeste knows what she's doing." He said it quietly. He did not say it twice. I did not need him to say it twice. I had never needed external confirmation for what I knew to be true about myself. This was, I would eventually understand, the precise quality that most frustrated my family. They could not diminish what they could not reach. They could not reach anything in me that I had not extended outward toward them. And I had spent 32 years learning to keep the most essential parts of myself at a careful distance from their reach. What they could diminish, and did, consistently, was everything visible. My wardrobe in those early years was a particular target. I dressed, by financial necessity, in clean, well-maintained clothing that was never fashionable. A navy blazer I had purchased on sale at a department store closing in 2009, worn so consistently that my mother had once commented, within earshot of company, that she hoped I was rotating my wardrobe properly, Celeste. I wore it anyway. I wore it to client presentations and city planning meetings, and to every single family dinner for 3 years, because I had made a choice to spend my money on drafting software and commercial liability insurance, and the salary of one part-time junior drafter I had hired before I could properly afford her. Her name was Ramona. She stayed with me for 11 years, until I promoted her to project director. But in 2010, Ramona was 24 years old and I was paying her a real wage from a client base. I was building one referral at a time, and I was wearing a navy blazer from a closing department store, and my mother was commenting on my rotation habits. The blazer became a symbol that I never named aloud. I knew what it meant. The family could see the blazer and feel confirmed in their narrative of me. What they could not see was the folder on my laptop labeled Pipeline, which by late 2011 contained the names of 43 potential clients and a projected revenue model I had built myself, referencing city development data I had spent 8 weeks analyzing. They saw the blazer. I saw the pipeline. That asymmetry was the foundation of everything that came later. Marcus's family, by contrast, had never paid particularly close attention to either of us. His parents were retired academics in Madison, Wisconsin, pleasantly distracted, fond of me in a general, unfocused way. His only close relative who registered our life with any genuine attention was his uncle, Raymond Kowalski, who attended family gatherings in paint-stained corduroys and a hearing aid he frequently left on the kitchen counter, and who had spent his career as a forensic accountant before an early retirement that everyone in the family attributed to burnout and what they called, charitably, his intensity. Raymond was the person my in-laws forgot to invite to things. He was the person my own family, when they occasionally intersected with Marcus's at a holiday gathering, dismissed in approximately 30 seconds as an eccentric. Raymond had a habit of sitting in corners at parties, nursing a single drink across an entire evening, and watching. He watched the way I watched. We had recognized this in each other at the first Christmas gathering Marcus, and I attended as an engaged couple, when Raymond had settled into an armchair in the far corner of the living room, and I had settled into the chair nearest him. And we had spent 40 minutes discussing the structural failures in the Willis Towers' original curtain wall system, while the rest of the party discussed the new season of a television program neither of us had seen. He had called me, unprompted, 3 weeks after Harmon Design Group filed its first official business documents with the state of Illinois. "You're going to need someone who understands what your numbers actually mean," he had said, without preamble. "Not just your accountant, someone who can read a financial architecture the way you read a building. I can do that if you want." I had wanted. Raymond Kowalski had functioned as my informal financial strategist for 12 years, meeting me quarterly at a diner in Evanston, where he drank black coffee and reviewed quarterly reports and asked questions that invariably revealed something I had missed. He charged me nothing. He said once, when I raised the subject of compensation, "family discount." He said it with the precise flatness of someone who considered the matter closed. My family knew of Raymond only as Marcus's strange uncle who doesn't talk much. They had no idea that Raymond had been the person who first identified, in 2016, that Harmon Design Group had the structural profile of an acquisition target, and who had spent the following 6 years helping me architect the firm's financial presentation, so that when a buyer came, the story our numbers told would be the story I intended them to tell. The first forensic callback object I want you to remember is a leather portfolio. Specifically, a cognac-colored, full-grain leather portfolio by a company called Saddleback Leather, model designation thin front pocket wallet in tobacco brown. I carried it to every client meeting from 2012 forward. I carried it because it cost $47 on sale and looked like it cost $400. I carried it because inside it I kept three things: the current project list, the current client correspondence, and a single index card on which I had, in the earliest years, written the monthly revenue target and, in the later years, the acquisition floor price I was willing to accept. I updated that index card annually. The final index card, the one I carried into the closing meeting for the acquisition, had 3 words and a number written on it in my handwriting, in black fine point pen. I will tell you what those 3 words were at the appropriate time. The second object I want you to hold is a coffee mug. A plain, white, 12-ounce ceramic mug from a company called Hassami Porcelain, purchased for $32 at a kitchen supply store in the West Loop, with walls so thin you could see the light through them when you held them up to a window. My mother had given me this mug as a birthday gift, not because she knew I loved Japanese ceramics, but because she had bought a set of 6 at a sample sale and had 4 left over and thought I might as well have one. She had handed it to me wrapped in a paper towel. I kept it on my desk at Harmon Design Group for 9 years. My name was not on it. It was not special in the way gifts are supposed to be special. It was a remainder. It was given to me the way you pass along something you do not need, to someone you expect will not know the difference. I knew the difference. I kept the mug because it told me something accurate about how I was perceived, and I preferred accurate information to comfortable illusions. The third object is a wire transfer confirmation number. Specifically, reference number 274 Alpha 99 Bravo 116, issued by First Midwest Bancorp on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, for the amount of $14,000,000, net of the acquisition fee and legal disbursements, credited to an account in the name of a limited liability company I had incorporated in Delaware 4 years prior, under a name that bore no reference to my own. Raymond had recommended the structure. Attorney Deirdre Aucaffer, a corporate transactions specialist in Chicago whom Raymond had referred to me in 2019, had executed it. The confirmation number was printed on a single sheet of standard copy paper, which I had folded once and placed inside the cognac-colored saddleback portfolio, behind the last index card. I am giving you these 3 things now because I need you to carry them. They are going to matter in ways I am not ready to show you yet. The years between 2010 and 2017 were the years of slow accumulation. The firm grew by a specific sequence of correct decisions made in the right order. Not luck, not connection, not the particular kind of social ease that my sister believed was required for professional success. When Bria told people about me at parties, when she mentioned me at all, she described me as my sister who does buildings or whatever. She said it with a slight lift at the end, a tonal signal that invited the listener to find this either charming or slightly pitiful. Most people chose charming. I never corrected the description. What I did during those years was build a portfolio of completed projects that included two nationally recognized civic buildings, a museum renovation in St. Louis that was reviewed in three design publications, and a residential development in the western suburbs of Chicago that won an award from the American Institute of Architects in 2015. The award was a bronze plaque. I displayed it in my office, not at home. I did not mention it at family dinners. My mother learned of it 7 months after the fact from a neighbor who had read a local newspaper article. She called me to say, "I heard you won some kind of architecture thing." I said yes. She said, "That's nice. Is it something you can put on a resume?" I said that I was not currently in the market for employment. She said, "Well, you never know." The conversation lasted 6 minutes. My father's relationship to my success was characterized by a particular kind of willing ignorance that I eventually stopped trying to correct. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had built his sense of safety around a specific, legible narrative of professional life, and my career did not conform to that narrative's shape. He did not know how to discuss it, so he did not discuss it. When extended family asked what his daughter did, he said, "She does design work, kind of like an architect." The kind of like was the tell. I held an active architect's license in the state of Illinois. I was not kind of like an architect, but I understood that his framing served a function for him, and I released my need for him to correct it. It was in the spring of 2017 that the first fracture appeared. I had not been looking for it. This is important to understand. I was not, at that point in my life, conducting surveillance on my family. I was working. I was in the middle of the most demanding project Harmon Design Group had taken on to date, a mixed-use development in the River North neighborhood of Chicago that required coordination with three separate city departments and had a timeline that left no room for anything outside of execution. Marcus was managing a structural engineering team on a bridge project in Michigan. We were, in the plainest sense, two very busy people who came home late and cooked simple meals and rarely discussed anything outside of logistics. My parents had been helping us, nominally, in the way that involved parents sometimes do. When Marcus and I had purchased our house in Lincoln Square 3 years earlier, my parents had offered to manage a small renovation of the back entryway during the period when we could not take time off from our respective projects to supervise it. We had accepted. We had given them access to the house. We had given them, at my father's suggestion, a secondary signatory arrangement on the household renovation account, a separate account I had opened with $32,000 specifically for the entryway project and nothing else. I discovered, on a Thursday evening in March of 2017, while reviewing the quarterly statements I kept in a manila folder labeled simply House, that the renovation account had processed four withdrawals I had not authorized. The withdrawals totaled $11,482.17. They had occurred over a 4-month period, in amounts small enough to avoid triggering the account's standard alert threshold. $240 here. $1,800 there. A withdrawal of $4,012 that had been, I could see from the description line, categorized as a home improvement payment, but to a vendor name I did not recognize. I did not call my father. I did not call my mother. I set the statement on my desk. I picked up the white Hassami porcelain mug, which I had brought home from the office the previous week when we had begun packing in preparation for a temporary office move, and I drank the last of my tea, and I held the mug up toward the window the way I sometimes did, watching the evening light press through the thin ceramic walls. Then I opened my laptop. I opened a new folder. I named it with a date. I called Raymond the following morning, before 7, from my car in the driveway because I did not want to have the conversation inside the house. He picked up on the second ring. I described what I had found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the particular flat voice he used when something confirmed a hypothesis he had not wanted to be correct, "Send me the full statement, all 4 quarters." I sent them before the call ended. He called me back in 40 minutes. He said, "This is a pattern, Celeste." This did not start in November. He said, "I want you to pull the statements from the full prior calendar year and send those too, and I want you to do it before you say a single word to either of your parents." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you have Attorney Aucaffer's direct line?" I said, "I have it memorized." He said, "Good." And then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to communicate that what he was about to say was the most important thing in the conversation, "Don't let them see you looking." I was already not looking. I was already building the folder. I was already cross-referencing vendor names and withdrawal dates against the project timeline my father had given me when he had taken on the renovation. I was already noting, with the specific, clean quality of attention I brought to structural analysis, that the pattern of withdrawals corresponded almost precisely to the months during which my sister Bria had been planning her first attempt at a vacation to Portugal with friends, a trip that had been, as I recalled from family conversation, ultimately funded by a loan from my parents that no one had specified the repayment terms for. I did not confront anyone. I documented. I organized, I filed. Attorney Ackheffer agreed to review the materials the following Tuesday at 11 in the morning. She reviewed them for 22 minutes. Then she looked up from her desk, removed her reading glasses, and said, "You have enough here for a civil recovery action and potentially more, depending on the vendor, if that vendor proves to be a shell." She said, "How do you want to proceed?" She said it the way she always said things, directly, without inflection, as if the question were logistical rather than personal. I said, "Slowly." She said, "That is almost always the correct answer." I drove home that evening through the kind of early spring weather that Chicago produces when it cannot commit to either season. A cold, thin rain falling through air that smelled faintly of thaw. I parked in the driveway. I sat in the car for 11 minutes. I thought about the navy blazer I had worn for 3 years to family dinners, while my mother commented on my wardrobe rotation, and my father described me as kind of like an architect. I thought about the Hassami porcelain mug, handed to me wrapped in a paper towel, a remainder from a set that had not been purchased with me in mind. I thought about the cognac-colored saddleback portfolio sitting in my desk drawer at the office with the final index card inside it, and the number written on that card, and the 4 years of financial architecture that Raymond and attorney Ackheffer and I had been quietly constructing, while my family had been constructing a story about what I was worth. I thought about all of it with the same focused, unhurried clarity I brought to reading a structural drawing, identifying the load-bearing points, tracing the lines back to where the weight was actually sitting. I went inside. Marcus was in the kitchen. He looked at me the way he sometimes did, the particular look that required no verbal component. I set my bag on the chair. I said, "We need to talk." He turned off the stove. He sat down. I sat across from him at the kitchen table where we had eaten hundreds of meals, and I told him what I had found, and what Attorney Ackheffer had said, and what Raymond had confirmed, and I watched his face move through 3 distinct phases of response that he did not attempt to conceal from me. Then I told him about the 60-day discretionary window in the acquisition's non-disclosure clause. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tell your parents and sister we're bankrupt. Let's see who stays." I looked at the table between us. I looked at my hands. I thought about the specific, clean feeling of watching light move through thin ceramic walls. I was already building the response before I knew I had made the decision. They had 11 days to show me who they were when they believed I had nothing. 11 days was more than enough time. Sunday dinner at my parents' house on Whitmore Terrace had a specific architecture of its own, one I had been studying for 32 years and knew the way I knew load calculations. By heart, by consequence, by what happened when something exceeded its design tolerance. The house itself was a 4-bedroom colonial built in 1981, with a center hall layout that my mother had furnished over 3 decades in a style I would describe professionally as aspirational traditional. Crown molding she had added in 2003. A dining room table that seated 10, purchased from a furniture showroom in Naperville that had since closed, with a surface so aggressively polished it reflected the overhead chandelier in a way that always made the room feel slightly more formal than the conversation warranted. Silk flower arrangements in a color my mother called dusty rose, that I would call, more accurately, the color of something that was once alive. I arrived at 5:47 in the evening, 13 minutes before the stated dinner time, which my mother had always considered the correct interval of early. Marcus drove. I sat in the passenger seat of our car and watched the familiar curve of Whitmore Terrace come into view through the windshield and felt the particular internal settling that comes not from comfort but from readiness. The kind of readiness that has nothing to do with relaxation. I was wearing a charcoal wool crepe dress I had purchased 4 months earlier from a small Italian manufacturer I had discovered through a client who worked in textile import. It was not a recognizable brand. It had no visible logo. It had cost $312, and it fit with the kind of precision that requires either exceptional luck or a very good tailor, and I had taken it to a tailor. It was not fashionable. It was not meant to signal anything. It was simply a dress in which I could sit for 3 hours and feel no physical discomfort, which was the only criterion that mattered to me for what I had planned. Marcus wore a gray sport coat over a dark shirt. No tie. He had dressed, as he always dressed for these dinners, in a way that was correct without being remarkable. This was, I had come to understand, one of Marcus's genuine gifts. He understood the value of not drawing fire. My mother met us at the door before we reached the porch steps. She was wearing a blouse I recognized as new, a deep burgundy with a subtle print, and earrings I had not seen before, gold with a small pearl drop. She had dressed, in other words, for an occasion. This was the first data point of the evening. Sunday dinners on Whitmore Terrace did not typically require new blouses. Bria's car was already in the driveway. Todd's truck was parked behind it. My father's car was in the garage, which meant he had not left the house since morning, which meant he had been home when Bria arrived, which meant whatever framing of the situation had been established before our arrival had been established without us. I noted this the way I noted the position of structural columns when I entered a building I had not designed. Quietly, precisely, without comment. Celeste, my mother said, and she hugged me with the particular quality of hug that communicates obligation rather than warmth. A brief, firm press of palms to my upper back, release, step back, assessment. Her eyes moved across my dress in approximately 2 seconds. She said nothing about it, which was itself a form of comment. In my mother's vocabulary, silence about an outfit meant the outfit had not cleared the threshold of what she considered worthy of remark in either direction. I said, "Hi, Mom, the house looks nice." It did not look particularly different from any other Sunday, but the compliment was the correct social lubrication and I applied it without hesitation, the way you apply caulk to a joint that you know will need to be opened later. Inside, the table was set for 8. This was also new information. Marcus and I were 2, my parents were 2. Bria and Todd were 2, that accounted for 6. The additional 2 place settings were for guests I had not been informed were attending. My father emerged from the kitchen doorway with a beer in his hand, and the expression he wore when he was slightly more comfortable than usual, which I had learned to associate not with genuine ease, but with the particular relaxation of a man who had already made up his mind about something, and was simply waiting for the evening to confirm it. "Celeste," he nodded. He shook Marcus's hand. This was their greeting, performed the same way every time, a nod and a handshake, the whole transaction taking approximately 4 seconds and communicating everything the two of them had never found words for. Bria was in the living room with Todd. She was wearing a dress I had seen in a boutique window in the Gold Coast 3 weeks earlier, coral silk, mid-length, with a neckline that Todd was clearly appreciating. She had her hair down. She was wearing the pavé engagement ring on a hand that she was keeping at a specific angle, wrist slightly elevated, which is the unconscious posture of someone who has recently acquired something they want to be noticed. She looked up when Marcus and I came through from the entryway, and her face did the thing it sometimes did, a quick, involuntary recalibration before settling into warmth. Bria was not a subtle person. She was not cruel in the way that requires intelligence. She was cruel in the way that requires only audience. "You made it," she said, with the particular inflection that implies the fact of your arrival is mildly surprising. "We always make it," I said, pleasantly, evenly. Todd stood and offered his hand. He had a grip calibrated for impressing fathers, and I was not a father, but I shook it the same way I shook every hand. Firmly, once, release. The 2 additional guests arrived at 6:02. They were my mother's sister, my Aunt Patricia, and Patricia's husband, Gerald, who was a recently retired high school principal, and had the particular manner of a man accustomed to being the most authoritative person in a room of 17-year-olds. Patricia was my mother's closest confidant, which meant she was also the person my mother called when she needed to rehearse a version of events. I had understood this about Patricia for 20 years. I watched her come through the door and kiss my mother on both cheeks, and I noted that she did not look surprised to see us. She looked, if anything, prepared. Gerald shook my father's hand with the enthusiasm of a man joining a team. I set my bag on the chair near the entryway and went to help carry dishes from the kitchen. This was what I had always done at Sunday dinners. I helped carry dishes. I asked if there was anything that needed finishing. I located the small, useful tasks that needed doing and I did them, because it was the most accurate way to move through a space and observe it, and because no one watches the person carrying the salad bowl. Marcus had taken a seat in the living room. He was talking to Todd about something. From the living room, I could hear Todd using the word portfolio, which could have meant several things for a man who sold commercial insurance, none of which I needed to investigate further. My mother was at the stove, finishing a roast she had started that afternoon. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and rendered fat. The white Hassami porcelain mug was not here. It was at home, on my desk, where I had placed it 2 days before after a conversation with Raymond that I will describe in a moment. I noticed its absence the way you notice any object that has been deliberately repositioned. I had moved it for a reason. The reason was that I did not want to think about it until I was ready to use what it represented. My mother said, without turning from the stove, "Patricia and Gerald haven't seen you in a while." I said. It's been about a year. She said, you've been busy. There was an entire sentence compressed inside those 3 words that I declined to unpack in that kitchen at that moment. I simply said, the firm keeps a full calendar, and carried the salad bowl to the dining room. Dinner was served at 6:23. The table arranged itself the way tables at family dinners always arrange themselves, not randomly, but according to a social physics that everyone obeys without discussion. My parents at the heads, Bria and Todd on one side, close to my mother, Patricia and Gerald across from them. Marcus and I at the far end, adjacent to my father, the structural position that communicates both inclusion and periphery simultaneously. The first 31 minutes of dinner were the performance that precedes the actual performance. Conversation about the roast. About Patricia and Gerald's recent trip to Scottsdale, Arizona. About Todd's firm's quarterly numbers, delivered by Todd with the enthusiasm of someone who believes financial performance is inherently interesting to all parties present. Bria described a vacation itinerary she and Todd were planning. She mentioned Lisbon. She did not mention how it would be funded. I ate. I asked Patricia one question about Scottsdale, because asking one question of the secondary antagonist is the correct social investment. I kept my wine glass at approximately the same fill level throughout, raising it to my lips at intervals that communicated participation without creating any condition in which I might speak before I intended to. Marcus talked with my father about the bridge project in Michigan. My father asked 2 questions, which was more than average. The bridge project had structural specifics that my father could translate into his vocabulary of professional legibility, which was why Marcus always led with it at these dinners. It was my mother who moved the conversation. She always moved the conversation. It was one of the genuine skills I had inherited from her and had spent years refusing to acknowledge because I did not want to look directly at what I shared with her. She waited until the main plates had been cleared and the second round of wine had been poured. She waited until the table had settled into the specific relaxed configuration that follows a shared meal, the moment when guards are lowest and the impulse toward honesty is highest, because everyone's blood sugar has normalized and the candles are lit and the room feels artificially like a place of safety. Then she said, leaning forward slightly over the table in a way that gathered the room's attention without demanding it, we should talk about your father and my anniversary trip. My father said, surely. She said, Douglas, their family. She said it with the warm, inclusive sweep of someone drawing a circle around the table. The warmth was genuine, which was the thing about my mother that I had always found most difficult to hold in my analysis. She was not performing warmth. She simply aimed it selectively. She said they were planning a trip to Italy for their 40th anniversary. She said it was something they had always wanted to do. She said, looking at the table in a way that landed particularly on me, we've been looking at the finances, and it's ambitious, but we think with a little help from the family, we can make it happen. This was the established grammar of these requests. A little help from the family was a phrase that had appeared in my family's financial conversations for as long as I could remember, and it had always meant a specific thing, that the cost would be distributed across whoever at the table could be made to feel that declining was equivalent to a moral failing. Bria said, Todd and I would love to contribute something. She said it looking at Todd, who nodded with the agreeable expression of a man who has not yet processed the numerical implication. Patricia said, Gerald and I will do what we can. There was a pause. The pause was directed at me. I could feel its direction the way you feel a draft, not because anyone pointed, but because of the way the room oriented. I said, what are you estimating for the trip? My mother said a number. The number was $14,000. She said it with the particular casualness of someone who has rehearsed saying it casually. Marcus's hand found mine under the table, 2 fingers. The lightest possible pressure. I did not react to the number. I did not look at Marcus. I lifted my wine glass with my free hand and took one measured sip and set it back down and said, that's a significant trip. My mother said, your father works hard. My father was looking at the table. I said, he does? I said it without irony. He did, that was true. None of what I said that evening was untrue. And then Bria, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone waiting for a cue she had been given in advance, leaned back in her chair and said, in the voice she used when she was delivering a verdict she believed was beyond dispute, I mean, Celeste, you've got the firm. You can probably just cover it, right? You basically have the most stable income at this table. Todd laughed, a short, supportive sound. My mother looked at the candle. My father took a drink of his beer. Patricia said nothing, but she folded her hands in her lap in the way of someone who is ready. I did not tighten my jaw. I did not produce any of the visible signs of a person absorbing an insult. I turned the stem of the wine glass 1/4 rotation clockwise between my fingers, a small, grounding movement that anchored me to the physical reality of the table, and I looked at Bria with the same calibrated attention I gave to any structure I was being asked to evaluate, and I observed the following. She was bright with the particular brightness of someone who has been told they are winning before the competition has been officially explained. She had been briefed. This was not improvised. The architecture of this dinner, the extra guests, the anniversary trip, the appeal to my professional stability had been planned before we arrived. My mother had designed it. Bria was executing it, I said. Let me think about the numbers. It was the correct answer for the moment I was in. It was not a yes, and it was not a no, and it closed no doors, and it gave me the 11 seconds I needed to complete the calculation I was running, which was not about the trip to Italy. Bria said, in the particular register of someone pushing on a boundary they have just tested and found yielding. I mean, it's not like you can't afford it. I said, no, it's not like that. And she took that as agreement, which was the first mistake of the evening that would eventually cost her. It was my Aunt Patricia who delivered what she must have believed was the conversation's killing blow. Patricia was not a subtle woman, but she was a loyal one, and what she was loyal to, in this specific moment, was whatever version of the story my mother had given her during the preparation period. She said, with the particular sincerity of someone who has convinced themselves they are helping, "It just makes sense, Celeste. You've been the successful one. It's nice to see that pay off for the whole family." I turned the wine glass stem another quarter rotation. Clockwise, my father did not look up. Marcus's two fingers remained on my hand. I said, "I appreciate that, Patricia." Then I excused myself to use the restroom. I did not use the restroom. I stood in the hallway between the bathroom and my parents' bedroom for 47 seconds. In the specific quality of quiet that old colonial houses produce when the walls are thick and the family noise recedes to a murmur. I stood with my back against the wall and my eyes on the ceiling, and I completed the remaining calculations with the undistracted precision that I had never been able to access in a room where someone was watching me. The total amount my parents had withdrawn from the renovation account was $11,482.17. The vendor that attorney Ockafer had identified as potentially problematic had been matched, through a combination of business registration records and a direct inquiry to the Secretary of State of Illinois, to a sole proprietorship registered to an address that corresponded to my sister Bria's first apartment in Wicker Park, occupied during the period 2015 through 2017. The sole proprietorship had no documented clients. It had no website. It had one registered trade name and one registered principal. My sister's name. I had held this information for 4 months. I had held it the way you hold a document that changes the legal meaning of everything that precedes it. Carefully, in a controlled environment, away from heat. I returned to the table. I sat down. I thanked my mother for the roast, which was genuinely well prepared. I had one more glass of wine over the following 40 minutes, during which the conversation moved to Bria and Todd's wedding date and the venue they were considering, a garden property in Geneva, Illinois that was hosting only 10 events per year, and was therefore, according to Bria, extremely exclusive. She mentioned that the venue deposit was due in 3 weeks. She mentioned that the total venue cost was $22,000. She did not look at me directly when she mentioned these things, which was, I noted, a different strategy than the one she had used during the anniversary trip conversation. The direct approach had yielded a noncommittal answer. The indirect approach was an attempt to create a different kind of pressure, one that accumulated through proximity rather than confrontation. I ate a piece of the dessert my mother had set out, a simple fruit tart from a bakery she favored, and I said nothing about venues. Marcus and I left at 8:51 in the evening. My mother walked us to the door. She hugged me again with the same brief, firm quality as the first hug, and she said, "We'll talk more about Italy." And I said, "Of course," and I walked to the car. We drove for 4 minutes in silence. Then Marcus said, "Patricia?" I said, "Yes." He said, "It was already decided before we got there." I said, "The place settings were a tell." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me tonight?" I said, "Drive me to the office." He drove me to the office. The Harmon Design Group offices were located on the 14th floor of a building in the West Loop that I had selected in 2016 because of the quality of the north-facing light and the ceiling height and the proximity to 3 separate transit lines. The office was currently in a holding pattern, staff continuing to work under a management agreement that was part of the acquisition's transition terms. I had an access card that would remain valid for 60 days post-close. I had 22 days remaining. I went upstairs. I unlocked the office. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I walked to my desk by the ambient light coming through the north-facing windows, the city spread out beyond the glass in the specific way that Chicago presents itself after dark, organized and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful if you know where to look. I opened my desk drawer. I took out the cognac-colored saddleback portfolio. I opened it, moved past the project list and the client correspondence, and I removed the final index card. The three words written on it in black fine point pen were, "Wait for Sunday." I had written them 14 months earlier, when Raymond and I had first begun mapping the scenario architectures. At the time, I had not known that the Sunday in question would involve an Italy trip and a garden venue in Geneva, and my Aunt Patricia's sincere conviction that my success was a family resource to be allocated by committee. I had simply known that there would be a Sunday. There is always a Sunday in families like mine. A moment when the accumulated assumptions of years gather into a single, legible request, and the person being requested from is expected to comply or to be reclassified. I took out my phone and called Raymond. He answered before the second ring. He had been expecting the call. We had agreed 3 weeks earlier that I would call on the evening of the first dinner that matched a specific set of criteria. The criteria had been matched, I said. They asked for 14,000 for Italy and then moved to the venue. Patricia and Gerald were there. It was staged. Raymond said, "Did they reference your income directly?" I said, "Bria did." She said the firm gave me the most stable income at the table. A pause, then, "Say that again." I said it again. He said, "That's useful." He said it with the specific satisfaction of a forensic accountant who has just received a documented verbal admission that confirms a pattern of assumed access to another person's finances. He said, "Did Marcus hear it?" I said, "He was sitting next to me." Raymond said, "Call attorney Acaffer in the morning, first thing. Tell her what you just told me, word for word." He said, "And tell her we're ready to move to the second phase." I said, "The Delaware structure?" He said, "The Delaware structure, the documentation package, and the letter." I said, "Which letter?" He said, "The one that establishes that the renovation account withdrawals were not familial gifts, the one that establishes them as unauthorized transfers, subject to civil recovery, from an account to which your sister had no legitimate access." He paused, then he said, "And Celeste, the vendor registration." I said, "I have it." He said, "Attorney Acaffer needs the original file, not a copy, the original." I said, "I have that too." He said, "Good." Then, in the particular flat tone he used when he was closing a conversation that had accomplished what it needed to accomplish, "You held it long enough, it's time." I said good night. I sat in my office for another 23 minutes in the ambient light from the north-facing windows. I looked at the city. I thought about my sister at the table, bright with winning, the coral silk dress, the pavé ring, the venue in Geneva. I thought about my mother's practiced casualness as she said $14,000. I thought about Patricia's sincerity, which was real, and which would not protect her from what sincerity cannot protect anyone from, the consequences of a story told with insufficient information. I thought about the white Hassami porcelain mug on my desk at home, waiting. I thought about reference number 274 Alpha 99 Bravo 116, sitting in the cognac-colored portfolio in my hands. I opened the portfolio one more time. I looked at the index card, three words in black fine point pen. Then I took out my phone and sent Attorney Aka for a single message. "Tomorrow, 7 a.m., your office." She replied in 4 minutes. One word, "Confirmed?" I put the phone in my bag. I put the portfolio back in the drawer. I stood up and walked to the north-facing windows and looked at the city for the last time that evening. That particular, organized, indifferent, beautiful spread of light that had looked back at me from this office for 6 years, through every late night and failed pitch and compromise and decision, and the particular accumulated accumulation of all the moments when I had chosen to keep working instead of explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was worth. I had sold this view. I had sold this office and everything in it and everything that had built them for $14 million and 0 cents, wired on a Tuesday morning to a Delaware limited liability company whose name appeared nowhere in my family's vocabulary. They were planning a wedding venue in Geneva and a trip to Italy. They were having this conversation with a woman whose acquisition had closed 11 days from now, from the perspective of the Sunday they believed was just ending. In 11 days, I would sit at another table. I would have the cognac-colored portfolio with me. I would have reference number 274 Alpha 99 Bravo 116 on a single sheet of folded copy paper inside it. I would let my husband say 4 words, and then I would show them the wire. Marcus was waiting in the car downstairs. I took the elevator down. I got in. He looked at me. I looked back at him. He said, "Ready?" I said, "Attorney Acaffer, 7 a.m." He nodded once, started the car, and pulled out into the West Loop night, and the building receded in the rearview mirror, and neither of us looked back at it. because there was no longer any reason to look back at anything. They would spend the next 11 days planning what they would spend. Attorney Ockhaffer's office was on the 22nd floor of a building on West Monroe Street, with windows that faced south and east, and caught the morning light in a way that made the room feel, at 7 in the morning, like a place where things were being decided rather than simply discussed. She had been at her desk before I arrived. Her coffee was already cold, which meant she had been there since at least 6. She did not mention this. She did not mention most things that were not directly relevant to the matter at hand, which was one of the qualities that had made me trust her. She was a small woman in her mid-50s, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead until she needed them, at which point she pulled them down in a single, practiced motion that communicated she was now operating at full precision. She wore a charcoal suit that morning. No jewelry except a watch. The watch was a simple thing, a slim, silver-cased dress watch with a white dial that I had noticed years earlier and later, identified as a 1967 Omega DeVille, inherited rather than purchased, worn with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who values a thing for what it is rather than what it signals. She had the documentation package spread across her desk when I came in. The documents were organized into 4 discrete groupings, each separated by a colored tab, and I understood immediately that she had not assembled this the night before. She had been building toward this meeting for longer than my single-sentence text message. She said, "Sit down, Celeste." She said it without looking up from the page she was reading. I sat. She finished the page. She set it at the precise right angle to the desk edge. She pulled her reading glasses down. She said, "Raymond sent me his full analysis at 11:47 last night. I've been reviewing it since 5 this morning." She looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for moments when the facts of a situation had exceeded the parameters of what either party had originally anticipated. Not alarm, something more precise than alarm. "What I'm about to tell you is not what either of us expected when you first brought the renovation account statements to me." I said, "Tell me?" She said, "The renovation vendor. The sole proprietorship registered to your sister's Wicker Park address. We traced the full transaction history through the state business registration and cross-referenced it against the withdrawal dates from your renovation account." She paused. She turned to the second tabbed section of the document package. "Bria did not simply receive money through that entity. She processed 11 separate payments through it over a period of 26 months. Those payments total $41,238.91. I did not move. I kept my hands flat on my thighs, a small, grounding pressure, and I looked at Attorney Ockhaffer, and I registered that number the way you register the reading on a structural integrity scan when it tells you that the load-bearing capacity of something you have been standing on is substantially lower than the engineering documentation claimed. I said, 41,000. She said, $41,238.91. Across 3 separate accounts. She turned another page. The renovation account, which you know about. A joint savings account held in your parents' names from which $11,614.00 was transferred to the same vendor entity across a 14-month period. And a third account. She paused. A custodial savings account, opened in your name and your parents' names jointly, established when you were 11 years old. I had not known this account existed. This was, in 14 years of running a business, including 12 years of quarterly financial reviews with Raymond Kowalski, the first I had heard of it. I said, "What was in it?" She said, "As of the last statement Raymond was able to obtain through the third-party inquiry process, the account held before the withdrawal activity, approximately $22,400. She said, "The account was funded across your childhood and adolescence from birthday gifts, a small inheritance from your maternal grandmother, and periodic deposits your parents made with the stated intent of contributing to your education or early adult financial foundation." She said, "The account was drawn down to a balance of 0 through a series of withdrawals beginning in 2014 and concluding in 2016. The withdrawals, 9 in total, were processed using a signature that the bank's own documentation identifies as an authorized secondary signatory." She turned to the third tabbed section and placed a document in front of me. It was a photocopy of a bank signature card, reduced to letter size, with 2 signature lines. The first line bore my father's signature. The second line bore a signature that was, in the clear, unhurried handwriting I recognized from a decade of birthday cards and holiday notes, my mother's name. Written in my mother's hand. Below her signature, in a smaller notation, was the date the secondary signatory authorization had been added to the account. The date was 3 months after I had filed the business documents for Harmon Design Group with the state of Illinois. I did not look away from the document. I let the information complete its full integration without interrupting the process. I was aware of my breathing. I was aware of the chair beneath me. I was aware that Attorney Ockhaffer was watching me with the careful, non-intrusive attention of someone who has delivered difficult information before and knows that the correct response to another person's processing is stillness. After approximately 40 seconds, I said, "She added herself to my account 3 months after I started the firm." Attorney Ockhaffer said, "Yes," I said, and then withdrew the full balance over 2 years. She said, "Yes," I said, and routed at least a portion of those funds through the entity registered to BRIA. She said, "Raymond believes the routing is demonstrable, but will require one additional step to prove conclusively. He has referred the question to a forensic accounting colleague, a Dr. Priya Mehta, who specializes in fund tracing and commingled asset analysis. Dr. Mehta has reviewed the preliminary materials and believes she can produce a traceable chain of custody for the funds within 10 business days." She said, "There is one more thing." I waited. She said, "The custodial account, when it was established under a specific regulatory framework that governs funds held in trust for a minor beneficiary. Under that framework, the custodian, in this case your parents, held a fiduciary duty to the named beneficiary, which is you. The withdrawals under this framework are not simply unauthorized transfers." She let that sentence breathe for a moment. "They are a breach of fiduciary duty, which is a civil matter with a specific statute of limitations and a specific remedy." She pulled her reading glasses back up to her forehead. The meeting portion requiring maximum precision was complete. She said, "Celeste, your family did not steal from you opportunistically. They did this with a structure. Someone planned this." She said it not with anger or drama, but with the clean, declarative quality of a person reporting a geological fact, which means we respond with a structure of our own. I said, "Raymond said you were ready to move to the second phase." She said, "I was ready to move to the second phase before Raymond said so." She turned to the fourth tabbed section. "But what Dr. Mehta produces will determine whether we pursue civil recovery alone or whether we prepare a referral to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office." I said, "Give Dr. Mehta the 10 days." She said, "I already called her this morning." She permitted herself a very small, precise smile. "I told her to expect your authorization." I left Attorney Ockhaffer's office at 8:44 in the morning. I took the elevator to the lobby and stood on the West Monroe Street sidewalk in the October light, which was thin and specific, the kind of light that comes after the summer haze has cleared and the air has the quality of cut glass. I stood there for approximately 90 seconds. Then I took out my phone and sent Marcus a single text message. It said, $41,238.91 plus the custodial account. He replied in 2 minutes. He said, "The childhood account?" I replied, "Yes." He did not reply again for 7 minutes. When he did, the message said only, "I'll call Raymond." I put my phone in my bag and walked to the parking structure and drove to a coffee shop in the West Loop that I had been going to for 6 years. A small place run by a Guatemalan family that roasted their own beans and kept the music at a volume that allowed conversation without requiring it. I ordered a black coffee in a ceramic cup that was nothing like the Hassami porcelain mug on my desk at home, and I sat at a corner table, and I opened the cognac-colored saddleback portfolio, and I wrote 4 lines of notes on the index card behind the final one. Then I closed the portfolio, drank the coffee, and went about the rest of my day. What followed over the next 9 days was the particular, specific form of psychological warfare that I had not planned, but had understood was likely, in the way that an architect understands that certain structural behaviors follow certain loading conditions, whether or not they appear in the original specifications. My family reached out. They reached out in the specific way of people who believe they have established a favorable negotiating position and are now simply managing the timeline of collection. My mother called on the Tuesday following the Sunday dinner. She did not call in the morning, which would have suggested urgency. She called at 2:47 in the afternoon, which suggested deliberation. She had decided on the time of the call. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail lasted 1 minute and 12 seconds and covered 3 topics: the Italy trip, which she referred to as our anniversary dream, a recipe she thought I might want, and a closing note that she just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page. The recipe was for a pasta dish she had never once made in 32 years of Sunday dinners. It was a non sequitur intended to soften the central message, which was that she was checking whether I had complied with the implicit expectation established at the dinner table. I did not return the call. I played the voicemail on speaker into a voice recording application on my phone, labeled the file with the date and time, and added it to the folder. Bria texted on Wednesday. The text was brief and phrased in the register of casual sisterly communication, which is to say it was phrased in a way that required me to understand a subtext that was the actual message. She said, "Hey, so Todd and I are looking at the venue deposit deadline. Just wondering if you've had a chance to think about things? It would mean so much." The capitalized word was, I noted, the tell. Genuine casualness does not deploy capitalized emphasis. Capitalized emphasis is the orthographic signature of someone who is trying to recreate in text the specific pressure of a face-to-face appeal. I replied, "Still thinking, things are tight right now." I added a single emoji, a face with a slightly apologetic expression. This was the correct register. It communicated receptivity without commitment. It gave her something to work with that was not a refusal. She replied within 4 minutes, "Oh no, is everything okay?" Two question marks. The doubling of punctuation is the textual equivalent of leaning forward. I said, "Just a rough patch, we'll figure it out." She said, "Of course you will, you always do." A pause of approximately 3 minutes, then, "But like, if you needed to, you could ask us for help, right? We're family." I looked at that text message for a long moment. The particular quality of its architecture, the pivot from receiving a request to offering assistance with the word family deployed as its load-bearing element, was a piece of social engineering that was, I acknowledged to myself, not without sophistication. She was repositioning herself as a potential resource rather than a claimant. It was a reasonable tactical adjustment. I said, "You're sweet, thank you." She said, "Love you." One heart emoji. I filed the thread, every message, every timestamp, every pivot. My father called on Thursday evening at 7:03. This was unusual. My father did not typically initiate phone calls to me. He answered them occasionally when he could not avoid it, and he produced from those conversations the minimum viable engagement of a man who considers the phone an inconvenient technology that somehow never improved on the telegraph. His calling me directly was a signal that someone had asked him to call me directly, which told me something about the internal choreography of Whitmore Terrace. He said, "Celeste." A pause. "Your mother wanted me to check in." I said, "Hi, Dad, everything okay?" He said, "Sure, sure." Another pause. Then, in the particular voice of a man delivering a script he has not fully memorized, "We were just thinking, with everything, the trip and all, it would be good to nail down the family contributions before the end of the month." I said, "I understand. I'm working through some things on my end." He said, "Things with the firm?" I said, "Things in general. It's been a complicated month." A pause long enough that I thought he might say something real. Then, "Well, your mother has her heart set on this trip." He said it not unkindly. He said it the way men of his generation communicate what they consider to be non-negotiable domestic facts. 40 years is 40 years. I said, "It really is, Dad." He said, "All right then." The closing formula of a man whose mission has been technically accomplished. "Take care of yourself." I said, "You too." The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I filed it. Patricia called on Saturday. This I had not expected in the specific form it took. Patricia called not to pressure but to counsel, which was a more sophisticated approach, and one that told me she had been briefed on the "things are tight" message I had sent Bria, and had decided that the correct intervention was pastoral rather than financial. She said, "Celeste, honey, I just want you to know that whatever is going on with you and Marcus financially, there is no shame in it. Everyone goes through patches." I said, "Thank you, Patricia, that means a lot." She said, "Your mother is just worried about you. She doesn't always show it the right way, but she is." I said, "I know she loves me." Patricia said, "She does, we all do." Then, with the particular segue of someone who has been waiting for the correct emotional moment to introduce a practical topic, and family is about supporting each other, in both directions. I said, "Of course." She said, "So whatever you can manage for the trip, it will be appreciated. No one is expecting you to stretch yourself, even just a contribution." I said, "I'll do what I can, Patricia." She said, "That's all anyone can ask." The call lasted 9 minutes and 53 seconds. Patricia, I noted, was a genuinely effective advocate. She had moved me from the ambiguity of "still thinking" to the implied commitment of "I'll do what I can" in under 10 minutes, using warmth as her primary instrument and familial solidarity as her secondary one. If I had been the person she believed I was, a woman under financial pressure who was susceptible to the particular combination of guilt and love that her approach deployed, it would have worked. I filed the call. I noted in the file that Patricia's language, specifically, "family is about supporting each other in both directions," was a documented verbal framing that established her awareness of the reciprocal financial expectation. It was a small thing. Attorney Ackheffer would know whether it was useful. Bria sent 3 additional texts over the following 4 days. The first asked if I had had a chance to think more. The second shared a link to a photo of the Geneva venue with the message, "Can you even imagine? It's so beautiful." The third, sent at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, said, "Hey, so we need to confirm with the venue by Friday. Any chance you could do like even 5,000 toward the deposit? We could work out the rest." $5,000. The number had been revised downward from the implied full contribution expectation. This was the negotiating behavior of someone who has determined that the original ask is at risk and has recalibrated to secure a partial commitment before the window closes. It was a reasonable adjustment. It was also, I noted, the first time a specific dollar figure had been requested from me in writing, in a text message, time-stamped, on a thread that I was actively archiving. I replied, "Let me see what I can move around. I really want to be there for you, Bria." She sent 4 heart emojis and a response that said, "You're the best sister, I mean it." I set my phone face down on the desk and looked at the Hassami porcelain mug for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone and added the thread to the file. The documentation package. By the time Dr. Priya Mehta completed her analysis and transmitted her findings to Attorney Akafer on the 8th business day, had grown from a single manila folder of bank statements into something that required, in its physical form, a steel gray accordion file with 12 tab sections, and, in its digital form, an encrypted folder on a server that Raymond had established through a data security firm in Minneapolis, whose services he had used for 20 years and trusted with the specificity of a man who trusts very few things. I drove to Raymond's house on a Wednesday evening, 8 days before the Sunday that I had been indexing my decisions to for 14 months. His house was a modest 2-story in Evanston, brown brick, with a front yard that he maintained with the same focused minimalism he applied to everything else: clean edges, no ornamentation, a single oak tree in the center that had been there since before the house was built. He met me at the door in his paint-stained corduroys and the gray cable-knit sweater he wore from October through March without apparent variation. He had the hearing aid in, which meant he intended to be fully present for the conversation. He had set up the dining room table as a working surface. The physical components of the documentation package were spread across it in the precise arrangement of someone who thinks spatially, each section of the accordion file open and accessible, each document within it positioned so its critical data points were immediately visible without requiring a full page turn. Beside the accordion file were 3 manila envelopes, letter-sized, sealed with red evidence tape of the kind Attorney Akafer had specified, each stamped in blue ink with a number and a date. The ink was fresh enough that I could smell it faintly when I sat down. The smell of fresh ink on archival paper is a specific, clean smell, and I registered it the way I registered all specific sensory information during that period, as a data point worth retaining. Raymond poured 2 cups of coffee from a French press he had prepared before I arrived. He set mine on the table to my left, where it would not risk being knocked onto the documents by a careless right-hand gesture. He sat across from me. He placed his own reading glasses on his nose and opened the file to the first tab section. He said, "Dr. Mehta's report." He turned the section toward me. Dr. Priya Mehta was 53 years old, a former senior examiner with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, who had left regulatory work to establish a private forensic accounting practice with a client list that Raymond had described to me once as the kind of clients you have when your work is too specific for anyone to find through a general search. Her report was 27 pages. It was written in language that was precise without being impenetrable, which is the mark of someone who has spent years communicating technical findings to judges and juries who are not specialists. Her conclusion, reached on page 23 and supported by 4 exhibits, was as follows. The funds withdrawn from the custodial account established in my name and drawn down between 2014 and 2016 had been commingled with funds from my parents' joint savings account and processed, in 8 of 9 identifiable instances, through the sole proprietorship registered to my sister Bria, which had then dispersed those funds to 2 destinations. The first destination was a personal checking account in Bria's name. The second destination, which Raymond had traced through the business registration cross-reference, and which Dr. Mehta had confirmed through direct bank inquiry under the authority of a third-party information request, was a credit card account in the name of one Todd Allen Burrows, who had, in 2015, been my sister's boyfriend of approximately 7 months. Todd, Commercial Insurance, Synergy. The total funds traceable, with documentation, to Bria's personal account, $17,412.00. The total funds traceable to Todd's credit card, $9,826.91. The combined total of all identified unauthorized withdrawals across all three accounts, $41,238.91. Dr. Mehta's report characterized the activity as consistent with a pattern of intentional diversion of funds from a custodial account held for the benefit of a named beneficiary, executed through a series of transactions designed to obscure the source and destination of the funds. She used the phrase, designed to obscure, 3 times in the report, each time with supporting documentation. I reviewed the report for 22 minutes. I did not rush the review. Raymond sat across the table and drank his coffee and did not attempt to summarize or editorialize. He understood that I needed to read the actual words myself, to let the actual weight of each documented finding land in the correct sequence. When I finished, I set the report down. I aligned it with the table edge, a habit I had picked up from Attorney Okafor without realizing it. I said, "Todd," Raymond said, 18 months before he and Bria became officially engaged. I said, "Did she know where the money was coming from?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. He said, "That is a question for Attorney Okafor. What Dr. Mehta can tell us is what moved and where it went. What Bria knew is a question of intent, and intent is Attorney Okafor's domain." I said, "And the custodial account, the fiduciary breach." He said, "Attorney Okafor's letter is in envelope number 1. He nodded toward the 3 sealed manila envelopes. It establishes the legal basis for civil recovery and preserves the right to pursue the matter under the Illinois statute governing custodial accounts and the duties of custodians. The statute of limitations has not expired. We are within the window by 14 months. I said, "And envelope 2? He said, "A complete copy of the documentation package, duplicate, certified with Dr. Mehta's report attached. For the state's attorney referral file if it comes to that." He paused. Attorney Okafor does not believe it will come to that. She believes the evidence of the civil matter will be sufficient to produce a resolution without criminal referral, provided the resolution offer is structured correctly. I said, "And envelope 3? He picked up envelope 3 and held it for a moment, looking at it with the expression of someone who has spent a great deal of time with a document and has arrived at a settled relationship with what it contains. He said, "This one is mine." He set it on the table in front of me. 12 years of quarterly financial analysis. Complete, bound, including the 2016 projection model, the acquisition preparation materials, and the documentation of every advisory conversation between you and me, including dates, topics, and recommended actions. He said, "I am not a licensed attorney. My materials are not privileged. But they are admissible as business records, and they demonstrate, comprehensively, that your financial trajectory was not accidental, not inherited, and not dependent on any family resource. Everything you built from documented, traceable decisions over a documented, traceable period of time." He said it the way he said most important things, without inflection, without drama, as if the information were simply a structural element he was pointing out in a drawing. I said, "Raymond." He said, "Don't." I said, "I need to say it." He picked up his coffee. He said, "You can say it after Sunday." I looked at the table. The accordion file, open. The 3 sealed envelopes. Dr. Mehta's 27 pages. The cognac-colored saddleback portfolio I had placed beside my chair when I sat down, with its final index card inside. The coffee Raymond had placed to my left, exactly where it would not risk the documents. I said, "Okay." I said, "After Sunday." We spent the next 2 hours completing the final organization of the physical package. Raymond walked me through each tabbed section with the thoroughness of someone who has prepared materials for legal proceedings before and understands that what is not organized cannot be found under pressure. We verified that every document had a corresponding entry in the digital index. We verified that the digital folder, encrypted on Raymond's Minneapolis server, had a second encrypted backup on a separate server that Dr. Mehta's office maintained for exactly this category of case. Raymond showed me the Internet Protocol tracking log, a document I had not seen before, that his data security contact in Minneapolis had prepared from the metadata associated with the email communications between my mother and the bank during the period of the custodial account withdrawals. The log was 4 pages. It showed, in columns of precise timestamps and numerical addresses, the specific devices from which those email communications had originated. The primary device was a desktop computer consistent with a residential internet service provider in Naperville, Illinois, zip code 65402, which is the zip code for Whitmore Terrace. The timestamps corresponded, in 6 of 9 instances, to hours between 9 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon on weekdays, which were the hours during which my mother had been, for the relevant period, either home from teaching or already retired. I held the tracking log in my hands and felt the particular weight of it, which was not physical weight but the weight of specificity. Specific timestamps, specific device identifiers, specific geographic coordinates reduced to a zip code that I had grown up in, that I had associated for 32 years with the smell of rosemary, and rendered fat and silk flowers in dusty rows, and the particular quality of being seen through rather than seen. I set the log back in its tabbed section. Raymond sealed the accordion file with a strap closure and placed it inside a flat-sided document case, dark gray, with a combination lock he had set to a 4-digit number he told me once and I had not needed to write down. He handed me the case. He said, "This goes with you, not to the office. Home." I said, "I know." He said, "Attorney Ockaffer wants to meet Sunday morning, 8 a.m. her office." He said, "She'll walk you through the sequence. What gets handed over and when?" I said, "Is she bringing the letter?" He said, "She'll have everything." A pause. "Celeste." He said my name the way he said it when he intended the sentence that followed to be the one I carried. "They are going to look at what you put in front of them on Sunday, and they are going to realize that every conversation they had, every text they sent, every phone call they made over the last 9 days was a conversation they had inside a room they did not know was being documented." I said nothing. He said, "You held this correctly from the beginning." I picked up the document case. I picked up the cognac-colored saddleback portfolio. I stood up. I said, "Good night, Raymond." He said, "Good night." Then, as I reached the doorway, "Bring the mug." I turned back. I said, "What?" He said, "The Hassami mug. Bring it Sunday. Put it on the table." He said it with the flat specificity of a forensic accountant who has been thinking about symbolic load-bearing elements for approximately as long as I had. "Let them see it." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Okay." I drove home. Marcus was in the kitchen. I set the document case on the table. He looked at it. He looked at me. I said, "Sunday." He said, "Sunday." I went to my desk. I picked up the white Hassami porcelain mug, the one that had sat on my office desk for 9 years, that had been handed to me wrapped in a paper towel, that I had held up to windows to watch the light move through its thin walls, that had traveled home with me the week the acquisition closed and sat on my desk since then, waiting. I turned it in my hands. I set it back down, not on the desk this time, but beside the document case on the table, where it would be the first thing I saw in the morning. Then I went to the table and I opened the cognac-colored saddleback portfolio and I took out the final index card, the one that said "Wait for Sunday" in black fine point pen, and I turned it over to the blank side and I wrote one more line. I did not need to think about what to write. I had known what it would say for 14 months. I put the card back in the portfolio. I closed the portfolio. I went to bed. Across town, in a house on Whitmore Terrace, my family was sleeping soundly inside the story they believed they were telling, every one of them carrying the comfortable weight of a victory they did not yet know was the most expensive thing they had ever bought. Attorney Ockaffer was already at the conference table when I arrived at 7:58 on Sunday morning. Raymond was beside her, in the paint-stained corduroys, the gray sweater, the hearing aid firmly in place. The document case was open between them. The 3 sealed manila envelopes were arranged in a row at the center of the table. Dr. Mehta's 27 pages were separated into 4 discrete stacks, each corresponding to a family member's name written on a small index card in Raymond's handwriting, placed at the top of each stack with the precision of a man who has spent 40 years understanding that organized information is the only kind that survives contact with chaos. I set the cognac-colored saddleback portfolio on the table. I set the white Hassami porcelain mug beside it. I sat down. Attorney Ockaffer looked at the mug. She said nothing about it. She pulled her reading glasses down and said, "We have 2 hours before the dinner." My mother had called on Friday to invite Marcus and me to what she described as a small family celebration for Bria and Todd's engagement, a dinner at Whitmore Terrace with the same configuration as the previous Sunday. Parents, Bria, Todd, Patricia, Gerald. She had said it warmly, with the particular warmth she deployed when she believed the social architecture she was building was load-bearing. I had said we would be there. I had said it the way you confirm a delivery window for something that is already in transit. Attorney Ockaffer walked me through the sequence. She was precise and she was brief, because the sequence itself was precise and brief. There was no improvisation in what we had built. Every element had a specific place and a specific moment, and her job that morning was to confirm that I understood the order of operations with enough granularity to execute it cleanly under the specific social pressure of a family dining room in Naperville, Illinois, with silk flowers in dusty rows and a chandelier that reflected off an aggressively polished table. She said, "You will not raise your voice at any point." I said, "I know." She said, "You will not make accusations." You will present documents and allow the documents to speak. If a family member asks a direct question, you answer it with a direct reference to the corresponding exhibit. If a family member becomes emotionally escalated, you do not match the escalation. You simply continue. I said, I know. She said, if your mother attempts to reframe the custodial account withdrawals as a parental decision made for your benefit, you refer her to Exhibit 7, which is the account's founding documentation, which specifies unambiguously that the funds were held for your sole benefit and were not accessible for any purpose other than your education or early adult establishment. I said, Exhibit 7. She said, if your sister attempts to claim that the sole proprietorship was a legitimate business entity that performed genuine services, you refer her to Exhibit 12, which is Dr. Mehta's analysis of the vendor's transaction history, which documents zero payments to any third-party service provider, zero business expenses consistent with a functioning home improvement contractor, and zero tax filings for either of the 2 fiscal years during which the entity processed payments from your accounts. I said, Exhibit 12. She said, if Todd speaks, you refer him to Exhibit 14. I said, the credit card documentation. She said, yes. She looked at me over the reading glasses. Do you have any questions about the sequence? I said, no. She permitted the small, precise smile. She said, then let's talk about what happens after. What happened after was the part that most people in my position would have found most satisfying to plan. I had found it instead, the part that required the most discipline to plan correctly, because the temptation in designing a consequence is always to make it larger than necessary, to let the architecture of the response exceed the architecture of the original wrong, which produces a structure that cannot support its own weight. Raymond and I had spent 3 evenings ensuring that what we had built was exactly the right size for what it needed to carry. Not larger, not smaller, exactly right. Attorney Ackefer outlined the post-dinner sequence in 11 minutes. The civil recovery demand letter, which was envelope number 1, would be presented at the table and would give my parents 30 days to respond. The letter documented the full $41,238.91 in unauthorized withdrawals, cited the specific Illinois statute governing custodial account fiduciary duty, and outlined the 2 available paths. Voluntary repayment with interest, calculated at the statutory rate from the date of each withdrawal, or civil litigation, at which point the documentation package, including Dr. Mehta's report and Raymond's 12-year financial analysis, would become part of the public court record. The letter also contained, in its final paragraph, a single sentence referencing the potential for a state's attorney referral in the event that the civil process did not produce a satisfactory resolution within the specified window. Attorney Ackefer had written that sentence with the care of someone who understands that the most powerful legal language is often the language that describes what has not yet happened. She said, the letter is self-executing. Once it is in their hands, the 30-day clock begins regardless of their response in the room. You do not need them to agree to anything tonight. You simply need them to receive it. I said, and the wire. She said, the wire transfer confirmation, reference number 274 Alpha 99 Bravo 116, is the final document. It goes on the table last. She paused. Raymond and I discussed the sequencing at length. The wire goes last because it recontextualizes everything that preceded it. Once they see the wire, the entire preceding presentation changes meaning. Raymond said, from his position at the corner of the table, without looking up from the document stack he was reviewing, it tells them that every conversation they had about Italy and the venue deposit and family contributions was a conversation they had with a woman who had already deposited $14 million into an account they did not know existed, during a period in which they were simultaneously processing unauthorized withdrawals from an account they were not supposed to touch. He said that is a specific kind of information to receive. I picked up the Hassami porcelain mug from the table. I held it in both hands. I did not drink from it. I simply held it the way I had held it for 9 years when I needed to think clearly, feeling the specific thin weight of it, the slight translucence of the walls. I said, let's go. Marcus drove. I sat in the passenger seat with the document case on my lap and the saddleback portfolio on top of it, and the Hassami mug wrapped in a clean cloth and placed in the cup holder between us. Marcus drove the way he always drove, with the focused, unhurried attention of a structural engineer who understands that the difference between a sound decision and a catastrophic one is often simply the quality of attention brought to each intermediate step. He said at the turn onto Whitmore Terrace, how do you feel? I said, The same way I feel when I submit a completed design, like the work is done and what's left is just the presentation. He said, "That's right." He pulled into the driveway behind Bria's car and Todd's truck and Patricia's sedan, and he put the car in park and he sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Then he said, "I'm right beside you." I said, "I know." I picked up the document case. That's always been enough. My mother opened the door before we reached the porch steps. She was wearing the burgundy blouse again, the same one from the previous Sunday, which told me the blouse had become her social armor for this particular sequence of evenings. She smiled the full smile she used for occasions she considered successful in advance. She hugged me. She said, "Come in, come in." The table was set for 8, same configuration. The roast was in the oven. I could smell rosemary from the entryway. The chandelier was lit. The silk flowers in dusty rows were on the sideboard where they always were. I set the document case on the floor beside my chair, partially under the table. I set the saddleback portfolio on top of it. I unwrapped the Hassami porcelain mug and placed it on the table to my left, in the position where a water glass might go. Bria looked at the mug from across the table with the particular expression of someone who has noticed something that does not fit the expected setting and has not yet decided whether to comment on it. She looked at it for approximately 3 seconds and then redirected her attention to Todd, who was telling Gerald something about commercial property values in the western suburbs. My mother said from the kitchen doorway, "Can I get you something to drink, Celeste? I have wine open." I said, "I'll have water, please." She brought a glass of water and set it beside the Hassami mug without remarking on the mug. She was too well practiced in selective attention to remark on something she had not yet categorized. Dinner proceeded according to the established grammar. Roast. Conversation. The particular family social physics that positioned Marcus and me at the far end of the table, adjacent to my father, slightly peripheral, nominally included. Bria was bright that evening in the specific way she had been bright the previous Sunday. The brightness of someone who is expecting the evening to confirm something. She had her engagement ring at the specific wrist elevation I recognized. She was wearing a different dress, emerald green, and she had done her hair in a way that communicated effort. She was dressed for a success she had already scheduled. Todd was relaxed in the particular way of a man who has been told that a financial problem is in the process of being resolved. He talked about his firm's expansion into the northern suburbs. He used the word leverage in a context that did not quite fit its technical meaning, but that the table received without correction. My father ate quietly. He looked at me twice during the first course with the expression I had learned to identify as awareness without vocabulary. The look of a man who senses that the terrain of an evening is not precisely what he was told it would be, but does not have the specific instrument to measure what is different. It was during the dessert, the same fruit tart from the same bakery, that my mother moved the conversation. She did it with the same practiced ease she had deployed the previous Sunday, leaning forward slightly, gathering the table's attention, letting the room settle into the configuration of a prepared audience. She said, "I want to say how glad I am that we're all together tonight." She looked at Bria with the warmth of a woman presenting her finest achievement. "This is a special time for our family." She looked at me. "And I think it's time we talked about making sure everyone feels supported." Bria said on cue, "Absolutely." She set her fork down. She looked at me with the particular focus of someone who has been waiting for this moment across several days of carefully managed text messages. She said, "Celeste, we really need to confirm the venue by this week. And I know things have been hard for you guys lately. But I just want you to know that whatever you can do, even a smaller contribution, it matters to us so much." She said it warmly. She said it with the particular warmth that had, across 32 years, been the most effective instrument in the family's social vocabulary when directed at me, the warmth that looked like love and functioned like leverage. I looked at her. I looked at the table. I looked at the Hassami porcelain mug to my left. I did not move quickly. I did not announce anything. I simply reached down beside my chair and placed the document case on the table, and I opened it, and I removed the accordion file, and I set it in front of me, and I opened it to the first tabbed section. The table registered this the way rooms register unexpected structural sounds, a brief, complete suspension of all other activity. I said, quietly and evenly, "Before we talk about contributions, I need to share some information with the family." My mother said, with the careful steadiness of someone who has just identified an unknown load on a familiar structure, "Celeste." I said, "Mom, please let me finish." I turned to the first tabbed section. I said, "In March of 2017, I identified 4 unauthorized withdrawals from the household renovation account that Dad had secondary signatory access to. The withdrawals totaled $482.17. I removed the relevant bank statements and placed them at the center of the table where everyone could see them. I did not confront anyone at the time. I began documenting. My father set his fork down. He did not pick it up again. I turned to the second tabbed section. I said, a forensic accounting review conducted by Dr. Priya Mehta, a former examiner with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, identified that the withdrawals from the renovation account were part of a broader pattern across 3 accounts. I placed Dr. Mehta's executive summary at the center of the table, beside the bank statements. The total amount of unauthorized withdrawals across all 3 accounts is $41,238.91. Bria said, Celeste, what is this? She said it not as a question but as an objection to the existence of the conversation, which was its own form of answer. I said, Bria, one moment. I turned to the third tabbed section. I said, the third account is a custodial savings account opened in my name when I was 11 years old, funded by birthday gifts, a small inheritance from Grandma Ruth, and periodic deposits made by mom and dad with the stated purpose of supporting my education or early adult establishment. I placed the account's founding documentation on the table. I pointed, without touching it, to the specific line that described the account's purpose. I said the account held approximately $22,400 before it was drawn to zero through 9 withdrawals between 2014 and 2016. My mother's face did not collapse. I want to be precise about this because I had spent 14 months wondering what her face would do at this specific moment, and the answer was that it did none of the things that faces do in the stories people tell about moments of exposure. It became very still. The stillness was the kind that comes not from composure, but from the rapid internal revision of a large number of load-bearing assumptions. It was the stillness of a structure in the moment between a critical failure and its visible consequence. I said, the secondary signatory on that account was added 3 months after I filed business documents for Harmon Design Group. I placed the signature card photocopy on the table. I did not point to the signature. I did not need to. Patricia said, now, I don't think this is the time or place for. I said, Patricia, thank you, please let me finish. She closed her mouth. Gerald was looking at the table. I turned to Exhibit 12. I said, Dr. Mehta's analysis traced the withdrawn funds through a sole proprietorship registered in the state of Illinois. I placed Exhibit 12 on the table. The sole proprietorship was registered to an address in Wicker Park, Chicago, during the period 2015 through 2017. I looked at Bria. It was registered to your name, Bria. Bria said, that was a legitimate business I was doing. I said, Exhibit 12 documents 0 payments to any third-party service provider, 0 business expenses consistent with a functioning contractor entity, and 0 tax filings for either fiscal year during which the entity processed payments. I said it the way Attorney Aucaffer had told me to say it, as a reference to a document rather than an accusation from a person. The entity processed funds from my accounts and disbursed them to 2 destinations. Your personal checking account, and I turned to Exhibit 14, a credit card account in the name of Todd Allen Burrows. The sound Todd made was not a word. It was the sound of a specific kind of air leaving a body. Bria said, that is not, we didn't. She stopped. She looked at Todd. Todd was looking at Exhibit 14 with the expression of a man reading his own name in a context he had not anticipated. My father said, Shirley? He said it quietly. He said it the way he said most important things once without repeating himself. My mother said nothing. I reached into the saddleback portfolio. I removed the final index card and set it face up on the table. 3 words in black fine point pen. Wait for Sunday. I said, I wrote that 14 months ago. I set it beside the mug. I have been waiting. I placed envelope number 1 on the table in front of my mother. I said, this is the civil recovery demand letter from my attorney, Deirdre Aucaffer. It documents the full $41,238.91 with interest calculated from the date of each withdrawal. You have 30 days to respond. I placed envelope number 2 on the table. I said, this is the complete documentation package. A duplicate certified copy, which is currently also held in digital form on 2 separate encrypted servers. If the civil process does not reach a satisfactory resolution, this package forms the basis of a referral to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. The table was very quiet. Then I reached into the document case one final time. I removed a single sheet of standard copy paper, folded once. I unfolded it and placed it at the center of the table where everyone could see it clearly. I said, this is a wire transfer confirmation from First Midwest Bancorp. Reference number 274 Alpha 99 Bravo 116. I said, It is dated 3 days before I told you we were struggling financially. I said, the transfer amount is $14 million and 0 cents, net of acquisition fees and legal disbursements. I picked up the Hassami porcelain mug. I held it in both hands. I said, I sold my architecture firm for $14 million. I set the mug back down. Every conversation we had about Italy and venue deposits and family contributions happened after this wire cleared. You were asking a woman who had already deposited $14 million to contribute to a family trip and a wedding venue, while simultaneously holding documents that would have told you she knew what you had taken from her. I said it without anger. I said it the way I would report a structural finding, as a fact about load and consequence, about what a thing could bear and what it had already broken under. My sister said, Celeste, she stopped. She tried again. I didn't know about the custodial account. Mom handled that. I didn't, I said. Exhibit 12 will speak to your involvement, Bria. What you knew is a question for Attorney Ockeffer and possibly other parties. I said it without cruelty. I said it as an accurate statement of jurisdiction. Todd said, look, the credit card that was. Bria told me it was a loan. She said her parents approved it. I had no idea it was anything other than. I said, Exhibit 14 is available for your attorney to review. My mother said, finally, in a voice I had never heard from her, a voice that had lost its practiced quality and become something smaller and more accurate. Celeste, we are your family. I did not tighten my jaw. I did not produce a single visible response to those 4 words, which were the same 4 words that had framed every unreasonable request and every ambient dismissal and every moment of selective visibility across 32 years. I simply looked at her and I said, I know, Mom, I know exactly what that has meant. I closed the accordion file. I placed it back in the document case. I picked up the saddleback portfolio. I picked up the Hassami porcelain mug. I stood up. Marcus stood up beside me, one motion, no hesitation. My father said, Celeste. He said it differently than my mother had. He said it with the particular quality of a man who has spent an evening seeing something he did not want to see and has arrived, at the far end of that evening, at the specific loneliness of someone who chose not to look sooner. I said, Good night, Dad. I walked to the entryway. I picked up my bag. Marcus opened the door. I walked out of the house on Whitmore Terrace, through the air that smelled of October and thin Illinois light, and I did not look back at the doorway, and I did not listen to determine whether anyone was following us, and I did not perform any of the available gestures of a woman making an exit designed to be watched. I simply walked to the car. Marcus walked beside me. We got in. He drove. Attorney Ockeffer received the confirmation call from me at 9:14 that evening. She said, the letter is in their hands. I said yes. She said, then the clock starts tonight. She said, get some sleep. She ended the call. I slept better than I had slept in 14 months. What followed over the next several weeks was not dramatic in the way that people who have not been through civil legal processes expect it to be. It was, instead, systematic. Consequential in the way that correct structures are consequential, steadily, completely, without negotiation. My parents retained an attorney within 72 hours of the Sunday dinner. The attorney was a general practice lawyer from a firm in Naperville who specialized primarily in estate planning and real estate transactions, and who contacted Attorney Ockeffer's office on a Tuesday morning with the particular combination of professionalism and uncertainty that communicates a practitioner who has reviewed a file and found it more serious than their client suggested. Attorney Ockeffer noted this and told me it was a favorable early indicator. The custodial account breach was the load-bearing element. The Illinois statute was not ambiguous. The fiduciary duty was documented. The breach was documented. The fund tracing was documented by a former federal examiner whose credentials were not a thing that a general practice lawyer from Naperville was positioned to dispute. Within 19 days of the dinner, my parents' attorney communicated a preliminary willingness to discuss a repayment structure for the full amount with interest. The interest, calculated from the date of each withdrawal at the applicable statutory rate, added $12,419.33 to the principal. The total repayment obligation, formally established through a civil settlement agreement that Attorney Ockeffer negotiated over 3 weeks of correspondence, was $53,658.24. My parents did not have $53,000 in liquid assets. This was not a surprise to me or to Raymond. Raymond had estimated this 18 months earlier when he had first identified the account activity, and he had noted, without editorializing, that people who strategically redirect funds they do not have authority over are frequently doing so precisely because they do not have adequate resources of their own. The Italy trip and the anniversary dream and the $14,000 ask had not been the requests of people with reserves. They had been the requests of people who had spent decades treating my financial resources as a family commons to be accessed under the right social conditions. The settlement was structured as a lien against the Whitmore Terrace property, registered with the county recorder's office, repayable over a 5-year period with interest. My parents' attorney had attempted to negotiate a lower rate. Attorney Acaffer had declined. The lien was filed and recorded. The house that had contained the dining room table and the chandelier and the silk flowers in dusty rows was now partially collateralized against a debt owed to me. My mother called once during the settlement negotiation period. She called on a Wednesday evening at 6. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was 3 minutes and 41 seconds, and it contained, in sequence, an explanation, a justification, an appeal to the long history of her sacrifices as a mother, and a closing note about family being more important than money. The explanation was the most interesting part. She described the custodial account withdrawals as borrowing, which was a word that required the existence of a repayment intention that the evidence did not support. The word borrowing was the tell. It was the word of a person who has not yet completed the internal revision of their own narrative, who is still applying the old vocabulary to a situation that has changed the meaning of every word they know. I did not return the call. I noted the voicemail in the file. Attorney Acaffer, when I mentioned it, said simply, "Noted," and nothing further. Bria's situation resolved differently and more publicly, which was not something I had designed but which followed logically from the way her situation had been structured. The sole proprietorship documentation, once it was in the hands of her parents' attorney, became a separate liability from the custodial account breach. Bria retained her own attorney, a young litigator from a small firm in Chicago, who reviewed Exhibit 12 and Exhibit 14 and called Attorney Acaffer to discuss the parameters of a separate civil matter. Those discussions took 6 weeks. The Geneva venue deposit was not paid. The venue released their date to another event. Bria's engagement did not dissolve, but it altered in the specific way that financial exposure alters relationships built on incomplete disclosures. Todd had not known the source of the credit card payments Bria had described as a family loan. Learning the accurate source of those funds, documented in Exhibit 14, produced a period of renegotiation between them that was not my business and that I made no effort to monitor. What I will say is that the wedding, as of the time I am telling you this story, has not been rescheduled. Patricia called me twice. I answered the second call because I recognized that Patricia was not a principal party to what had occurred and that her role had been one of sincere advocacy based on a story she had been given without its full context. When she called the second time, I answered. She was quiet for a moment after I said hello. Then she said, "I didn't know." She said it simply without elaboration. I said, "I know, Patricia." There was a long pause. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad." The call lasted 3 minutes. It was the most honest conversation I had with a member of my family in that entire period. My father did not call. He sent a letter. An actual letter, handwritten on plain white paper, mailed to our home address in Lincoln Square. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that he was sorry in a way that was not a full sentence, meaning it was an expression of sorrow without a specific object, which I understood was the maximum precision he was capable of in written form. The second paragraph said that he had always been proud of me, and that he had not said so, and that he understood if that was no longer adequate information. I kept the letter. I put it in a separate folder from the documentation package. Some things do not belong in evidence files. They belong in the other kind of record, the one you keep not for legal purposes, but for the more private purpose of understanding what a person was and was not able to give you, and choosing, slowly and without urgency, what you intend to carry forward. 6 months after the Sunday dinner on Whitmore Terrace, Marcus and I closed on a property in a neighborhood in Chicago with north-facing light and ceiling heights that I had specified to the millimeter. The kitchen had a window that caught the late afternoon sun in a specific way that made the room feel, at 4 o'clock, like a room designed for staying in. I put the Hassami porcelain mug on the kitchen windowsill, where the light moved through it every afternoon. I did not put it out of sight. I did not retire it. It had earned its place in the light. Raymond came for dinner 3 weeks after we moved in. He ate a full meal, which was unusual. He drank 2 glasses of wine, which was unprecedented. He sat at our kitchen table in the corduroys and the gray sweater, and he looked at the mug on the windowsill for a long moment, and he said, "Good placement." I said, "I thought so." The Saddleback portfolio is in my home office, in the top drawer of my desk. The final index card is still in it. I have not replaced it with a new one. I am not currently indexing anything to a future Sunday. I am in a period that does not require that kind of patience because it does not require that kind of endurance. Dr. Mehta sent a note after the settlement was finalized. It was a brief, professional communication, 2 sentences, saying that the case had been a clean piece of work and that she was available for future engagements. Raymond, when I mentioned it, said, "She doesn't say that often." I filed the note in the good drawer. If you are still with me at this point in the story, I want you to understand something about why I told it the way I did. Not with screaming. Not with a confrontation designed for maximum visible drama. Not with the particular performance of wounded dignity that this culture has decided is the correct aesthetic for a woman who has been wronged by her family. I told it the way I built every structure I ever designed, with attention to load, with respect for sequence, with the understanding that the thing that lasts is not the thing that makes the most noise during construction, but the thing that is still standing when the noise is over. Here are the 5 things I want to leave with you, because they are the things I wish someone had said to me 20 years before I was ready to hear them. The first is this: the people who treat your success as a resource they are entitled to access are telling you something specific and accurate about how they understand the relationship between you. They are not confused. They are not expressing love in an imperfect form. They are showing you the actual architecture of what they believe your role is in their lives. Believe them, the information is useful. Act on it at the pace that is correct for your specific situation, but act on it. Do not spend 14 years applying interpretive charity to a structure that was never designed with your interests as a load bearing element. The second is this: documentation is not aggression. I have heard, in the time since this story became known to the people in my life who needed to know it, several variations of the suggestion that what I did was extreme, that keeping records and involving attorneys is somehow a disproportionate response to what was, when you reduce it to its simplest terms, family. I want to be precise about this. $41,238.91 removed from accounts that did not belong to the people who removed them is not a family matter, in the sense that word is usually deployed, which is to say, it is not a matter that should be handled with silence and the preservation of social comfort. It is a financial matter with legal parameters. Treating it as a financial matter with legal parameters is not extreme. It is accurate. The third is this: the silence of the person who is gathering information is almost always misread by the person who is generating the record. My family spent 11 days and 7 weeks after the Sunday dinner believing that my silence was submission. They believed that my things are tight and my "I'll see what I can manage" and my unanswered calls were signs of a woman who was complying with the expected narrative. People who mistake your composure for compliance will, without exception, generate more evidence while they wait for you to fold. Let them. A patient person in a documentation process has an asymmetric advantage that most people do not understand until it is too late for the understanding to be useful. The fourth is this: the ally who sits in the corner of the party and watches is almost always the most valuable person in the room. I spent 12 years receiving quarterly financial wisdom from a man in paint stained corduroys, who most of my family dismissed in 30 seconds. Raymond Kowalski understood the structure of my financial life better than anyone I have ever met, and he offered that understanding freely and precisely, across 12 years, without once seeking recognition for it. The people who are actually for you are frequently not the ones performing their support in the center of the room. They are the ones sitting in the corner, nursing a single drink, watching, and understanding what they see. The fifth is this, and it is the one I want you to carry most carefully. The moment you stop needing their approval is not a loss. I know this is counterintuitive. I know that the architecture of family, especially family that has weaponized love as leverage, is designed to make you feel that their approval is load bearing, that without it, something essential in you will fail. It is not true. It has never been true. The approval of people who have been treating you as a resource is not approval in any meaningful sense. It is a rating system applied to how effectively you are serving their requirements. When I stopped requiring their rating, I did not lose anything structural. I gained approximately 14 months of the clearest thinking I have ever done in my life, during which I built, with Raymond and attorney Ockheffer and Dr. Mehta and Marcus beside me every step of the way, the most precise and well-documented response to a long-standing wrong that I have ever been part of constructing. I am sitting now in the kitchen of the house with the north-facing light and the ceiling heights I specified to the millimeter, with the afternoon sun coming through the window and moving through the walls of the Hassami porcelain mug in the way that thin ceramic allows, and the cognac-colored saddleback portfolio in the drawer of my office down the hall. And the wire transfer confirmation filed in a place I do not need to look at because I know exactly what it says, and I know exactly what it is worth, and I know exactly who I am in the clear, specific, adequately documented relationship to all of it. I built a firm for 15 years. I sold it for $14 million. I watched my family reveal, in 11 days of believing I had nothing, precisely and completely what they had always valued me for. And then I showed them the wire. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever sat across a table from people who share your blood and felt the specific loneliness of being seen as a resource rather than a person, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are in your own story. I read every one, and more importantly, I remember that not everyone who needs to hear this is at the end yet. Some of you are in the documentation phase. Some of you are still holding your silence in a room where someone is misreading it as surrender. Some of you are just beginning to name what the structure actually is. Wherever you are, keep building, keep your records clean. Keep the people who actually see you close, and keep a patient, unsentimental eye on the people who only look at you when they need something. Keep your boundaries strong. Guard your peace, and I will see you in the next.